Ever wondered how the excessive bleeding rules work in Conquest Aerth? It's a crucial mechanic that can entirely shift the tides of battle. Essentially, these rules are applied to most weapons, unless their properties specify otherwise. The standard rule for excessive bleeding is activated when a single wound caused by a weapon exceeds a character's total genetics or comparable quasi-attribute like Constitution, Grit, Determination, and others. If this happens, the character will lose half a health point each round until the bleeding is stemmed. Without medical or magical intervention, a roll under Resilience can be attempted every 20 rounds to see if the bleeding slows naturally. The excessive bleeding rules enhance the gameplay's realism and depth, making each combat encounter unique and unpredictable. Understanding these rules can drastically alter the outcome of your battles, so let's dive in. First, let's talk about the standard bleeding profile, which applies to most weapons unless stated otherwise. This rule is the norm for weapons that cause an average amount of bleeding and are not specifically enhanced or modified. It's also applicable for weapons that do not cause any bleeding due to their inherent nature, for instance, a flamethrower that cauterizes wounds. Now let's dive into the nitty-gritty of the standard bleeding profile. If a weapon inflicts a wound that doesn't exceed the victim's total genetics or an equivalent quasi-attribute, such as Constitution, Grit, Determination, the standard amount of damage is inflicted. In this case, the excessive bleeding rules do not come into play. However, if a wound inflicted by a weapon with a standard bleeding profile does exceed the victim's modified genetics or relevant score, then the excessive bleeding rules kick in. This means that the character will lose half a health point per round until the bleeding is stemmed. This additional damage applies to each wound that fits this criterion. Without medical or magical intervention, a roll can be attempted under Resilience on a 100-sided die every 20 rounds to see whether the bleeding can slow through natural clotting. If medical attention is provided, this same roll can be attempted each round, with a myriad of effective modifiers coming into play. It's worth noting that there are weapons, skills, and other factors that can increase the amount of bleeding, and just as many circumstances that can increase the likelihood of the excessive bleeding rule coming into play. A weapon's bleeding potential is typically described in terms of the amount of bleeding it causes, while its secondary description relates to the likelihood of that extra damage. In more extreme circumstances, such as internal bleeding, there may be a tertiary description, but this is far less common. As we move forward, we'll delve deeper into these descriptions and their effects on the standard rule. This is just the beginning. The bleeding can get much worse. Now let's delve into the different levels of bleeding severity. These primary descriptions range from standard to the most extreme, exsanguinating. Each level represents a unique situation in the game and can have real-world parallels. Starting with the standard level, which we also refer to as serious. In game terms, a standard wound causes a loss of half a point of health per round. In real terms, think of a deep cut that steadily drips blood. Next, we have severe bleeding. This is a step up from standard, causing a loss of 1 point per round. Picture a gushing wound that needs immediate attention, like a deep puncture or a slice from a sharp object. Intense bleeding is even more serious. This level causes a loss of up to 2 points per round. This might be comparable to a deep stab wound, where blood is flowing freely and quickly. Profuse bleeding is next on our scale. This can cause a loss of 2 points per round. In real-life terms, this would be akin to a major arterial wound, where blood is spurting with each heartbeat. Massive bleeding is where things get really critical. This level can cause a loss of up to 3 points per round. Imagine a traumatic injury like a gunshot or a deep, wide wound. Catastrophic bleeding is the penultimate level. This causes a loss of 3 points per round. In the real world, this could be a severed limb or a deep abdominal wound. Finally, we reach exsanguinating, the most extreme level of bleeding. This can cause a loss of up to 20 points per round. An exsanguinating injury is life-threatening within minutes. Picture a severe traumatic injury with multiple deep wounds, like a catastrophic car crash or a fall from a great height. Each level of severity is more dangerous than the last, and that's not all there is to it. Remember, this is just the primary description of bleeding severity. There are secondary and tertiary factors that can further influence these scenarios. In addition to severity levels, there are factors that affect how the bleeding rules apply. Let's dive deeper into the secondary descriptions that influence the likelihood of excessive bleeding. These factors can range from standard to uncontrollable, and they play a vital role in determining the fate of a character. Starting with standard, this factor comes into play when a wound's damage must exceed the character's genetics points for bleeding to occur. In real terms, this is like a deep cut that goes past your skin and into your muscle, causing more serious blood loss. Moving on to extensive, this happens when a wound's damage must exceed half of the character's genetics points. This can be likened to a serious injury, such as a stab wound, which cuts deep into the body and leads to substantial blood loss. Automatic bleeding, as the name suggests, happens immediately and without any prerequisites. This can be compared to a severe wound, like a gunshot or a deep stab wound, that causes immediate and heavy blood loss. Prolonged is a tricky one. Here, a natural stemming roll is made every D100 rounds instead of the usual D20. This is akin to a severe injury that doesn't stop bleeding easily, such as a deep laceration or a gunshot wound. The last one is uncontrollable, where there is no natural stemming roll, and the medical intervention modifiers are halved. This can be compared to a grave situation, like a major artery being cut, where the bleeding is rapid and difficult to control, requiring immediate medical attention. Remember, these factors are not just numbers or game mechanics. They represent realistic scenarios that could happen in a real battlefield or dangerous situation. Understanding them can help you strategize better and turn the tide in your favor during gameplay. These factors can make a critical difference in the battlefield, but there's even more to consider. In extreme circumstances, tertiary descriptions come into play. We've covered the primary and secondary descriptions that dictate the severity of bleeding and factors influencing it. But let's delve deeper into the realm of extremes. These tertiary descriptions apply when the bleeding has escalated beyond the norm, from standard to the highly unusual, otherwise known as atypical or abnormal. Firstly, the standard, tertiary description doesn't apply any additional conditions. It's business as usual, however gruesome that business might be. Next, we have additional, where the total damage from accumulated wounds must exceed the character's genetics points. Imagine a character being worn down over time by multiple wounds, each not severe on its own, but together they push the body over the edge. Then we have accumulative, a more extreme version of additional. Here, the total damage from accumulated wounds must exceed just half of the character's genetics points. This represents the body's resilience being pushed to its limits, struggling to keep up with the onslaught. Internal comes next, where healing from blood loss is halved. This represents injuries that damage internal structures, making recovery more challenging and prolonged. Intestinal is similar, but healing from blood loss is halved and rounded down. It's like internal, but with the added complication of the digestive system being affected. Intracerebral is when every 12 health points lost from blood loss result in decreased intellect and reflexes. This signifies bleeding within the brain, disrupting cognitive and motor functions. Spontaneous bleeding occurs 100 rounds after its cause, a ticking time bomb of sorts that can catch a character off guard in the midst of recovery. Lastly, we have atypical or abnormal, which requires a unique case-by-case description. This is the wild card of the bunch, covering any other extreme bleeding scenarios not defined by the other categories. These extreme circumstances can be game changers, literally and figuratively. So, we've covered a lot of ground today. We started with the standard bleeding profile, which applies to most weapons unless they cause unusual amounts of bleeding or are enhanced by skills or equipment. We then moved on to the primary descriptions of bleeding severity levels, ranging from standard to exsanguinating, each with their own effects on a character's health points per round. We explored the secondary descriptions, which are factors that increase the likelihood of the excessive bleeding rule coming into play. And finally, we delved into the extreme bleeding circumstances of the tertiary descriptions, which are rare but can significantly impact a player's ability to recover from blood loss. From understanding the impact of a weapon's bleeding potential to recognizing the signs of internal bleeding, we've journeyed through the intricate rules of excessive bleeding in Conquest Aerth. Now you're equipped with knowledge that could save your character's life in Conquest Aerth. Remember, in the world of role-playing, knowledge is power.